What's up, everybody? This is your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga, here to bring you another video with no frills, just the analysis. And today I'm here to bring you the review of Hunter x Hunter episode 122 entitled Pose and Name. Finally, finally, Netero versus Miriam. It has begun! How long have we been waiting for this fight to pop off? I don't even know. 8, 9 episodes? I don't know. I can't remember. All I know is finally, it's here. Netero versus Miriam. What you've all been waiting for. And this was just another epic ass episode. It's just nothing can be said about this episode except that it was just pure awesome sauce. Another great episode. So, looking at my notes right here, I see that this is going to be a pretty long episode review, so let's get right down to it. Let's just jump right into the summary and analysis of this episode. First of all, and this is just more of a joke than anything else, how long were they traveling to that battlefield? Because I swear, this is starting to feel like DBZ type time. It just seems like they were traveling to that battlefield for a long ass time. Now, again, I don't remember how much time has elapsed between when they first got into the palace and when the fight between Miriam and Netero started. But man, it feels like they were traveling to that battlefield for freaking hours, man. That's just the way it feels. Alright, so only two things really happened in this episode. One, Pito explains the current situation to Poof. And two, Miriam chastises Notaro. That's just the best way to put it. Miriam chastises Notaro. So first, let's start off with the whole Pito situation. And let's try to quickly get this out the way. Well, maybe not quickly, but let's try to get this out the way first. The important thing to consider here, and this is not just for the pedo situation, but just in general, as it pertains to the Chimera ants, the humans, and the relationships between the Chimera ants and the humans. The psychological and ethical transformations that are happening, especially with the Chimera ants, but to a certain extent also with the humans, but just especially with the Chimera ants. These psychological and ethical transformations are about interpersonal relationships. In other words, they're about the relationships between the characters. It's not just characterization on an individual level. It's not just about the individual psychology of the characters, but it's about how the characters relate to each other ethically and psychologically. It's about the relationships between the characters. Uh, and this is why I always focus on not just psychology, but especially in my last review, I talked about social psychology, xenoanthropology, to use all the big, to go all big words on you. Because this is a point that I don't want other people to just gloss over or just forget about. It's not just the individual psychology of the characters that is at stake here. It's about the social psychology of the character, how the characters relate to each other and the relationships between the characters psychologically. That's an important thing to keep in mind throughout this entire arc. So I just want to make that clear as a sort of segue or as a prelude to talk about Pito in particular, especially as it pertains to this episode. When I talk about the evolution of the characters, therefore, I'm talking about the coevolution of the characters, because a lot of the important psychological and ethical transformations that happen within the characters, especially the Chimera ants, that would not be possible in the absence of their particular relationships with the other characters in the series. And I talked about this extensively with Miriam and Miriam's relationship to Kamugi, and also Yuppie and Yuppie's relationship with Knuckle and Morel. So it's important to keep in mind that all of these characters are going through psychological and ethical transformations because of their relationships with each other. And what's important as well is that even though all of these various characters are going through psychological and ethical transformations, these transformations are not necessarily identical, and they don't always happen at the same rate. And this causes the characters to, not causes, but it forces them to reevaluate their relationships with each other. Because the characters who started off as seemingly natural allies, or the characters who started off in such a way that they seem to understand each other, it's getting to the point where these relationships are becoming more and more complicated, and they're becoming more and more strained. And sometimes, as we saw in this episode, these characters actually lose the ability, or begin to lose the ability, to understand each other because of the various psychological and ethical transformations that are going on. Important example of this is Pedo in this episode. And the narrator explicitly points this out. The narrator says, Pedo deliberately did not mention, and this is when Pedo was explaining the current situation to Poof. The narrator says, Pedo deliberately did not mention how the king had held Kamugi because Pedo did not know how to describe the events accurately. In other words, Pedo doesn't have the experience or the ethical and psychological resources at this point to properly evaluate the situation, and therefore explain it in a way that both Pedo understands and that Poof would understand. So this is important to consider at all times. That even though these characters are going through their own transformations, they're not all going through the transformations at the same rate. And they become out of sync with each other. They don't always understand each other. Their relationships with each other change. And so it becomes, their relationships become more complicated and more strained. And this is exactly what happened with Yuppie and Poof in this episode as well. So when Poof finally catches up with Yuppie, one of the things that Poof realizes is that he says that Yuppie has grown up. And this is just his way of saying Yuppie's changed. And as a result of Poof recognizing that change in Yuppie, Yuppie gets a little bit suspicious. Gets a little bit suspicious of Yuppie, Yuppie, and so Poof has to test Yuppie. He has to see where his alliances lie, to see if he still has the same intentions and motivations and purposes. And even though Yuppie assures Poof that, yeah, we need to go to the king, I'm still all about protecting the king, we know that this has become somewhat complicated to a certain extent, because just in the last episode we saw that Yuppie didn't quite decide to kill Morel and Knuckle and Shoot and Melaoron. In other words, by not eliminating clear threats to the king and to the royal guard, Yuppie went against his own biological and, to a certain extent, his own social programming. So it's important to recognize how the character changes in Yuppie manifest themselves. He's still allied with the king, to be sure. However, he's now gone through a process where he's had to newly evaluate his motivations, his desires, his intentions, his purposes, and his priorities. And so Yuppie, through his experiences and through his relationships with the other human characters, has come to a better understanding of his self-consciousness. And we see that happen with both Pito and Yuppie in this episode, which is quite complex to say the least. To not just have a scenario where characters are going through their own psychological and ethical transformations individually, but are going through those psychological and ethical transformations with respect to each other, with respect to their own interpersonal relationships, and how their different rate of transformation strains and complicates their prior relationships with each other and creates new relationships between the characters. Like I said, this is just fantastic writing by Togashi. Now let's talk about the fight between Netero versus Miriam. So first of all, I love the way this fight starts off because it brings the ideological conflict between Miriam and Netero right to the forefront. When Miriam starts by asking Netero just straight up, why do you fight? Why are you fighting me? And I love this because, like I said, physical conflicts, especially in shonen manga, physical conflicts are vehicles, they're instruments. They're just external ways of expressing deeper ideological conflicts in the narrative. And I like the way this is immediately brought to the forefront in this fight when Miriam asks Netero that question. So I want to talk about this ideological conflict from really three different perspectives. First, I want to talk about Miriam's continuing psychological and ethical transformation. I want to talk about Netero's, really his sort of catch-22 that he's in right now. And the third thing I want to talk about is this Chimera ants versus humans motif I've been coming back to again and again. So first, Miriam's transformation. What's interesting here is that Netero is immediately thrown off by Miriam's question. And he's so thrown off that he immediately avoids it. And what he says is something to the effect of, how do you know I'll lose this fight? Don't underestimate me or you'll get burned. But notice how he's saying these things, but he avoids Miriam's initial question, which is, why are you fighting? Why do we have to fight each other at all? And once Netero sort of avoids that question, Miriam is then given an opportunity to explain himself. And he has to do this in a way that prompts Netero to answer the question. So Miriam goes on about how he initially he thought that humans were just livestock, and how his beliefs changed because now he's come to the conclusion that some humans actually deserve to live. And what's important for Miriam at this point is that he's gained a new ability. He's gained the ability which is almost like a superpower. It reminds me of a phrase when people say, um, how does the phrase go? Common sense is so rare nowadays that it's almost like a superpower. And Netero, not Netero, but Miriam has gained a sort of superpower. He's gained the ability to reflect on his own growth and to reflect on the growth of his own self-consciousness. And this doesn't just go for characters and stories, but it goes for humans as well. Our ability to narrate our lives, to give an account of ourselves, as it were, is an integral component of self-consciousness. In fact, I would go so far as to say that without our ability to narrate our own lives, self-consciousness would be impossible. Because self-consciousness just is the ability to narrate our own lives, to give an account of ourselves, to and not just give an account of ourselves, but to give an account of ourselves to other people, to explain our beliefs and emotions and our psychology and our ethics to other people. And this is what Miriam is doing to Netero. And it's not just an expression of self-consciousness, but it just is self-consciousness. It is his newfound ability to engage in a self-reflexive act, to engage in self-consciousness. And Miriam, as a way of doing this, is able to explain his newfound motivations and intentions and desires. And he's talking about how the world is mad and how it's unequal and how it's not just and how it's not fair. And this is what he says to Netero. He says, I will crush this madness and create a world so fair the very concept of inequality will be forgotten. And here's the thing. Of course, it's always a good thing to think about how Miriam is using his newfound self-consciousness to become a more psychologically astute person and to become a more ethical person. Not only humans can be persons. I just want to get that out of the way because it might seem like a paradox, but not only humans can be persons. Persons encompasses more than just being a human. Personhood is about consciousness, self-consciousness, psychology, ethics, those things. And those things are not just relegated to the domain of humanity. So I just want to get that paradox out of the way right quick. But going back to Miriam, uh, it's important to realize that even though Miriam is engaging in his newfound self-consciousness, he really lacks the experience of using that self-consciousness and of using his psychology, his newfound psychology and his newfound ethics. Because if he's saying that he wants to crush inequality so that it's forgotten in the world, the obvious question that one has to ask is, why should Miriam be the one to do this? Why should Miriam be the one to rule? Why is it his prerogative to rule? Is it merely because he has the power to do so, to enforce his will? Does power necessarily mean that you have a right to rule? And what does it mean to put yourself in a position to dictate equality? Are some people more equal than others? If that's the case. And this reminds me of a book by George Orwell, not his most famous book, which was 1984, but another book he wrote. If I'm not mistaken, actually, I don't remember when he wrote this book, but his lesser known book, or novel rather, which was Animal Farm. And it reminds me of a scene in Animal Farm where the pigs have finally taken over the farm. And one of the pigs becomes the de facto ruler of the farm because he's supposed to be the smartest and most intelligent animal on the farm. And the pig says, everybody is equal. but some are more equal than others. Classic point in that novel. And this is just like Miriam. What gives Miriam the right to rule? Is it if he wants to get rid of inequality, doesn't that mean that he has to get rid of in inequality that would be imposed by him being the ruler of the world? So Miriam is trapped in a conundrum that he doesn't recognize because he doesn't have the experience to use his newfound power, both of his self-consciousness and his physical power, in a judicious way. He still has the sort of mentality of a child. So his transformation is not quite complete, not quite there yet. Now let me talk about Netero's situation, his catch-22 that he finds himself in. So I've already hinted at this, but Netero is a slick customer. He's very adept at finding ways to why do I keep wanting to say evoid? To avoid the central issue being raised by Miriam. So after Miriam goes on his whole spiel about how he wants to crush inequality in the world, Netero and also one thing that I'm forgetting, Miriam also offers Netero a chance to live. Miriam flat out says, I think that some people in this world deserve to live, and you're one of that people. So if you just back off now, then you'll be allowed to live. I'll spare your life. And Netero's response to this is to answer the question of why he fights, but in a rather roundabout way. So he's answering the question by not answering the question. So he says, yeah, you'll allow me to live, but what about the rest of humanity? What about everybody else? You'll kill them off though, right? And Notaro says this in a sort of elusive manner. He says it in such a way that the implication is that Netero is fighting for the rest of humanity, right? He says, you'll let me live, but you'll kill everybody else. I can't have that. So the implication is that Netero is directly fighting on behalf of humanity. But if this is the case, why doesn't he just explicitly say that? Why doesn't he just come right out and say, I think you're evil because you'll kill everybody else and I'm fighting on behalf of humanity? Why is he going around in circles? And it gets revealed that the reason why he's trying to avoid these ethical issues and the central ideological conflict with Miriam is because he's really on a mission of genocide. It was revealed in this episode that the task that he was given was to eradicate all of Chimera ants, basically kill them, engage in genocide. And this puts Netero in a sort of catch-22 because his task is to kill all the Chimera ants, even though he realizes, or he's starting to realize now, that that's probably not the most moral response. And what's interesting is the ethical dilemma that Netero now finds himself in, because Netero is on the precipice of destroying something that, while admittedly is very dangerous, the Chimera ants are dangerous, there's just no question about that, they have a real potential to be something beautiful. And it's clear that Netero was very reluctant to act on that mission of genocide. I mean, he's going to do it, but he's hesitant in doing so. But what's also interesting in this exchange between Miriam and Netero is that Netero's motivations for fighting seem to change in midstream. First, Netero gives Miriam an answer that seems to imply that he's fighting on behalf of humanity, even though he's really on a mission of genocide, and even though he probably to a certain extent both believes that he has to kill the Chimera ants because they're dangerous, but also that he believes that the Chimera ants are becoming more moral, and he points this out that the ants are becoming more and more like humans. They're wavering between being ants and humans. He also has an ulterior motive for engaging this fight that's revealed throughout the fight. And this goes back to a point that I made maybe like a month or so ago when I talked about how various characters seem to have ulterior motives for engaging in these fights, so that we get to see multiple sides, multiple aspects of these characters, multiple motivations that these characters have. Netero feels insulted by Miriam, and he gets angry because of this. When Netero tries to attack Miriam doesn't even really defend himself. He doesn't even respond with physical violence to Netero. He treats him like a bug. He just brushes off his attacks and he says, "Come on, you will only be able to influence me by using words." And Netero's response is like, "What the fuck?" Compared to me, he's a newborn brat. And it feels, I mean, what Miriam said to Netero is what you would say if you were chastising a child. Like, come on, stop throwing a temper tantrum. You can change my mind, but only if you calm down, only if you become reasonable and talk it out. So we immediately see that Netero is a complex and multi-layered character because he has multiple motivations and desires for acting the way he acts. On one hand, he recognizes that the Chimera ants are becoming more moral, so he's hesitant in fulfilling his mission. On the other hand, he wants to fulfill his mission of genocide because he recognizes that the Chimera ants are extremely dangerous. And on top of that, he has an ulterior motive for engaging in this fight with Miriam because now he feels insulted. So there are multiple layers to the characterization of Netero revealed in this episode. And finally, I just want to address very quickly again this motif of the Chimera ants versus humans. So, an important question that I think was raised in this episode was Netero's phrase when he says, or when he describes Miriam as wavering between an ant and a human. And my question is this: do humans have a monopoly on morality? I mean, as a practical question, the answer is obviously yes, because in the real world, on the planet Earth, humans are the only species capable of morality. But of course, it's not inconceivable that throughout the universe there could be some other species or some other intelligent life form that could be thinking about morality and ethics just like we are. So the question is, do humans have a monopoly on morality or goodness or justice or inequality? And the answer to that is obviously no. So why does Netero describe Miriam's situation as wavering between human and ant? Is he so conceited that he thinks that morality and ethics is the sole province of humans? Is it that he's just being myopic because from his reference point, from his perspective, in the Hunter x Hunter world, only humans are capable of ethics and morality? And it becomes clear that humans are not the paradigm of morality or justice, especially if we consider Miriam's prior words, where he talks about how it's insane that borders divide up humans such that on one side of the border humans starve, but on the other side of the border they live in, in plenty. So it's clear that humans don't have a monopoly on morality. And a better description of Miriam's situation is that he's wavering between being a psychopath with a God complex and being moral and ethical. Not that he's becoming more human, but that he's becoming more moral, more ethical. Because again, humans don't have a monopoly on morality and ethics. In the Hunter x Hunter world, at least. And not even in our world as a matter of logical possibility. So another great episode from Hunter x Hunter. Like I said, I think last week's episode was better than this episode, but this week's episode was still pretty awesome and some of the best episodes of anime, like I said, that I've seen in quite a long time. So this was your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga. Just brought you another video with no frills, just the analysis. Peace and have a blessed day.